buenos días. Agradecerles a todos y todas, en particular a todas, que estén aquí como presidente del Instituto Catalán Internacional para la Paz. Vamos a iniciar esta jornada seminario sobre la resolución 1325, 15 años después. Lo vamos a hacer de acuerdo con el programa que ustedes conocen. Por tanto, en primer lugar, yo voy a hacer una breve contextualización en el marco de lo que yo conozco más, que es el trabajo del Consejo de Seguridad como órgano genérico, no específicamente respecto a la 1325, que hará nuestra colega Ala Muravit, y posteriormente tendrán las dos mesas redondas vinculadas a casos específicos y a la continuidad, más las conclusiones en las jornadas. Lo que quería decirles, pues, es relativamente sencillo y está vinculado a un número monográfico de la revista del ICIP, una institución pública pero autónoma, que es la que les acoge aquí. Este número monográfico, que se hará público en los próximos días, dedicado a la 1325, inicia con un editorial donde cito una habitación propia de Virginia Woolf. Para muchas de las personas que están aquí, en particular las mujeres y vinculadas al feminismo pacifista, saben que en una habitación propia Virginia Woolf planteaba las dificultades que debía enfrentar una mujer para hacer carrera literaria y concluía que debía contar con dinero y una habitación propia si quería escribir ficción. Décadas después, al examinar, 15 años después, el contexto de surgimiento, la evolución y las perspectivas de la resolución 1325, creo que se puede utilizar metafóricamente, obviamente, la cita de Virginia Woolf. La resolución reconoció la necesidad de crear una habitación propia, pero 15 años después, por anticipar a lo que tal vez sean las conclusiones del seminario, lo cierto es que en el mundo hipermasculino y restringido de la seguridad en Naciones Unidas, pese a que las resoluciones del Consejo de Seguridad sean de obligado cumplimiento, según el artículo 25 de la Carta de Naciones Unidas, lo cierto es que, como verán en algunos de los documentos que están en la carpeta, en particular el informe que elaboró María Villellas, la habitación propia sigue siendo inexistente, un proyecto con comunicación difusa con el resto de cámaras y habitaciones de la comunidad internacional, y con recursos no suficientes. ¿Qué quiere decir eso? Que si pensamos en el horizonte de aquí a 15 años, 2030, sin cambios en las perspectivas o en algunas situaciones, la conmemoración será tan agridulce como es hoy. Importancia de la resolución, trabajo hecho, interés, perspectivas, pero tanto en lo nacional como en lo regional como en lo internacional, mucho por avanzar. En este sentido, lo que yo quisiera comentar son tres cosas brevemente. Para llegar a una conclusión, necesitamos seguir trabajando como se ha hecho, pero un cambio de enfoque. La resolución 1325, para anticiparles mi conclusión, no es una resolución exclusivamente del mundo de mujeres, exclusivamente vinculada a la tarea de la lucha por la paz desde la tarea ya iniciada en 1915 en la Primera Guerra Mundial por la Liga y otros. No. La resolución 1325 es una resolución del Consejo de Seguridad, obliga a todos y debe plantearse en ese contexto. Primer momento, por tanto, de mi intervención, el contexto de surgimiento. Suele olvidarse que en el año 2000 estábamos todavía en pleno consenso sobre la paz liberal, algo que hoy, en el marco de Naciones Unidas, está ya fragmentado y es difícil de creer. Estábamos en un contexto en que la seguridad había cambiado, se entendía como un proceso multidimensional, donde los retos, los peligros, las amenazas no eran los propios de la seguridad nacional y de la Guerra Fría, sino que eran contextos en que los retos y peligros se tenían que ver sobre todo con el papel de los civiles, con la hiperpresencia de conflictos armados de naturaleza interna y no interestatal, con el sufrimiento de civiles y en particular de mujeres, niños y niñas en los contextos armados y con un contexto también especialmente importante hoy en día. Del 500.000 de víctimas por armas de fuego que se producen en el mundo cada año como promedio, solo un 20% tiene que ver con violencia política directa, terrorismo y conflictos armados. El otro 80%, es decir, 8 de cada 10 muertos, tienen que ver con otros contextos ya desde el año 2000, básicamente de inseguridad ciudadana, de delincuencia transnacional, entre otras cosas, delincuencia transnacional vinculada a la trata de personas, a la esclavitud, a otros mecanismos desde esa perspectiva. El contexto, por tanto, del surgimiento es el contexto de la seguridad humana, de la necesidad de proteger a personas y a contextos. Eso es el año 2000. Y, aunque no habría habido resolución 1325 sin el trabajo constante de muchos años de un cabildeo, de incidencia política, de lobbying de muchas organizaciones de mujeres y la complicidad de algunos, y en particular algunas diplomáticas también en este sentido, lo cierto y lo fundamental es que la seguridad humana estaba ya ahí. Por tanto, el contexto era el cambio de la naturaleza de los conflictos armados y la creciente presencia de actores privados, legales e ilegales, por la pérdida parcial del monopolio de los medios masivos de violencia por el Estado en ese momento. Y quisiera que leyeran la resolución 1325 en ese sentido, porque lo fácil es decir, bueno, es una resolución que trata de mujeres, paz y seguridad. No, trata de paz y seguridad y le da un énfasis particular a las mujeres. Segunda idea para mí importante de la lectura de la resolución 1325. Si uno ve la estructura profunda de la resolución, aparte de los 4 pilares obvios de que se habla, participación, protección, prevención, ayuda o auxilio y reconstrucción, lo importante es de lo que se está hablando básicamente en un órgano especializado en paz y seguridad, es del hecho de que en el contexto de un programa de paz, un suplemento a un programa de paz, el informe Brahimi sobre operaciones de paz, todo eso antes de la resolución, lo que nos está diciendo es que la seguridad debe abordarse desde perspectivas y enfoques diferentes, porque las experiencias vitales de seguridad son diferentes en varones y en mujeres, y que si no se tiene en cuenta la perspectiva de las mujeres, no solo hay una negación, un fracaso de derechos, porque se excluye a algo más del 50% de la población, sino que, y eso es lo importante de la resolución, los procesos de negociación, los procesos de construcción de paz, los procesos de reconstrucción post-violencia directa, los procesos de desarrollo, no tienen suficiente éxito. Lo que está diciendo la resolución, por tanto, es que la importancia de la inclusión de las mujeres no es solo y per se por la discriminación secular de las mujeres en terrenos internacionales, sino también porque es bueno como perspectiva de inclusión para el conjunto de la humanidad y de los problemas de la comunidad internacional. Lo que se está diciendo desde esa perspectiva, por tanto, es que una perspectiva incluyente de la seguridad garantiza mejores resultados de seguridad para todos y todas, no solo para todas, en problemas de desarme, de desmovilización, de reintegración, en mecanismos hasta ahora muy ajenos a la tarea de las mujeres, como la reforma del sector de seguridad, básicamente militar y muy masculinizada, o otro tipo de elementos. Y lo que han demostrado, y con eso concluyo el segundo momento de mi intervención, los informes y las reuniones de los últimos 15 años, es justamente que ese informe incluyente tiene un valor crucial de buen desempeño general y de mejores y más persistentes resultados para la seguridad. Por tanto, la petición de habitación propia es una petición en la que mejorará el conjunto del edificio de la humanidad. El último comentario que quería hacer, antes ya de pasar la palabra a Eulalia para que presente a Ala Murabit y que escuchemos lo importante, que es su intervención inaugural, es que la evolución reciente de la 1325 nos da también algunas ideas de perspectivas futuras. Ya hace 5 años, en ocasión del seminario internacional que realizó el Instituto para la Paz de Estados Unidos, se planteó con claridad que ya hace 5 años el impacto de la 1325 se notaba en 4 elementos del marco internacional. 1, evolución del derecho internacional, y la hay. 2, por supuesto, empoderamiento de las mujeres. 3, evolución de las Fuerzas Armadas, aunque eso genera el debate con el antimilitarismo, la escasa pero mayor presencia en 15 años de la mujer en las Fuerzas Armadas y en las operaciones de paz de Naciones Unidas, de acuerdo con el último informe, el aparecido en el mes de octubre, y liderado, coordinado por ONU Mujer, digamos, a ese respecto. Y, por último, en cuanto a la seguridad internacional. Desde esa perspectiva, las diversas resoluciones aprobadas en el 2008, 2009, 2010, la recién aprobada ahora, digamos, en ese contexto, nos marcan cosas. Pero, sin embargo, quiero añadir un elemento de preocupación. Hace 15 años no se había producido la securitización de nuevo de la seguridad que marcó el 11 de septiembre del 2001. Y, en mi opinión, hay algunos elementos preocupantes en la última resolución a ese respecto y que me consta que fueron discutidos seriamente sobre esa perspectiva porque vuelven a tener una concepción muy restringida de la seguridad y no propia de la seguridad humana. Uno lo puede entender intelectualmente por el contexto y por la preocupación sobre la lucha contra ciertas formas de terrorismo supuestamente ligadas, no realmente, a legitimaciones islamistas, aunque es una mala expresión. Desde esa perspectiva, yo creo que vale la pena volver a leer esa resolución y plantearnos, por último, las perspectivas futuras. Y con eso concluyo. Como verán en una de las sesiones de este seminario, hay que establecer nuevos horizontes en el trabajo de la 1325. La perspectiva del trabajo de masculinidades, que sí que se va a trabajar esta tarde, o otros elementos. Pero la idea de fondo que les dejo es esa. No dejemos que reduzcan la resolución 1325 a una eventual concesión a la tarea de incidencia política de las mujeres en el Consejo de Seguridad. No, es una resolución plenamente coherente con el trabajo del Consejo de Seguridad, presionado por los cambios de contexto y por otros actores nacionales desde 1900, desde el fin de la Guerra Fría hasta el presente. Y así hay que trabajarlo, y así hay que recordarlo. Es cierto que el horizonte de resoluciones que no se cumplen del Consejo de Seguridad es alto, pero también habría que recordar en ese sentido la 1325 desde esa perspectiva, porque el enfoque de la 1325 es el único que puede asegurar que la seguridad humana vuelva a estar en la raíz. Como solía decir una de las primeras defensoras de la visión femenina desde la diplomacia oficial, Alba Myrdal, Premio Nobel de la Paz y alta defensora de los temas de desarme, hay que recordar que en los temas de seguridad lo importante es la radicalidad. Y radical, a veces nos olvidamos, en la etimología latina significa ir a las raíces. Por tanto, lo que les sugiero es que volvamos a las raíces de la 1325 y, por tanto, desde esa perspectiva, gracias por estar aquí y gracias por acompañarnos en esta jornada.
Hola, buen día, buenos días. Las guerras han evolucionado mucho y actualmente son los civiles las principales víctimas de las guerras. Y cuando hablamos de civiles, pues evidentemente hablamos de mujeres, de niños, de los grupos más vulnerables. Por lo tanto, la 1325 recoge esta evolución y la importancia de reconocer, como ha dicho Rafael, el sufrimiento de las mujeres en las guerras, pero también la exigencia de su participación en la resolución de las mismas. Y en esta línea me toca el placer y el honor de presentar a una mujer muy joven, pero que se ha destacado por su activismo extraordinario en la defensa de la participación de la mujer. Ella fundó en 2011 The Voice of Libyan Women con la intención de combatir el extremismo. Murabit lidera esta lucha y ha obtenido muchos premios. Por ejemplo, obtuvo el premio Ashoka Fellow y fue la primera mujer en Libia en obtenerlo. También ha sido nombrada una de las mujeres menores de 25 años a la que seguir por Newsweek y por la BBC. Asimismo, es asesora global precisamente de la 1325 en las Naciones Unidas y también participa en el programa Everywhere, Every Woman Everywhere en la Universidad de Harvard. Uno de sus vídeos sobre lo que dice mi religión sobre las mujeres ha sido uno de los vídeos más vistos de 2015 y elegido como el vídeo del día por TED Talk. Les dejo con la señora Murabit. Gracias.
Hello? Okay. So first, thank you so much for having me. And I completely agree with what... So yes, it's been a lifelong dream of mine to learn Spanish and Catalan, and arriving in the airport last night, I recognized it more than ever that I genuinely need to start learning. Because I've been saying this for 10 years. I've been saying I will learn, and I'm unfortunately very far behind. But I plan on taking advantage of everyone here to teach me at least one word. So by the time I leave, I can put maybe a sentence together. So first, I'm extremely honored and excited to be here and very thankful for the privilege to address you all. 2015 is no doubt a historic year for women. 15 years ago this October, Resolution 1325, which we've been referring to as Women, Peace and Security, was adopted. And since then, significant strides have been made, at least on a global scale, to ensure the increased participation, representation, leadership, and importantly, protection of women globally. Now, 1325 was passed from, as Raphael so wonderfully said, a human history of ignoring women, of treating them as either victims or spoils of war, or collateral damage in many cases. And it was a unanimous declaration and recognition that without women, peace was essentially impossible. That meant that without failure, women had to be part and parcel of any conflict resolution or peace talk. So this included having women at the table. This included services specifically catering to the specific vulnerabilities that women face in conflict, at the very minimum. Now, where was I during this historic moment? Unlike Ruth, I was not campaigning outside the UN on the lawn. I was 10 years old. So, yes. So the numbers 1325 meant absolutely nothing to me between waking up early to watch my Saturday morning cartoons and trying to make sure I did not eat any vegetables at dinner time. I really had no involvement in the adoption of 1325 15 years ago. In fact, when I was born and raised in Canada until I was 15, I actually didn't really understand the point of women's rights in general. I'm one of 11 kids. I have 5 brothers and I have 5 sisters. And growing up, my parents were exceptionally good at treating us all the same, unless you got better marks. So I was actually always treated much better than my brothers. Their excuse is that they did not try in school. Mine is just that we were smarter, but no one really knows. But I never grew up thinking that because I was a woman, I would be limited. Because I was a woman, I would be unable to participate. The exact opposite. I had the example of a mother. I had the example of a sister who was a pediatric plastic surgeon. I never felt limited. When I moved to Libya, I was 15 years old. And I moved to my parents' hometown, which is called Zawiya. It's about 40 kilometers away from the capital, Tripoli. And it is quite a conservative city. Very tribal, very historically based, and very traditional. And it was only there that I began to feel that my gender did limit me. Society, regardless of my own contribution, ideas, opinions, did value my male counterparts much more than I. And my dream of becoming, when I was younger, I had dreamt of becoming a doctor, a surgeon, to be specific. It had to be. And it was, in the hospital was the only place where I genuinely felt valued, where I felt equal and necessary. Because in a hospital, nobody looks at your gender. Families, when they're in need, when they have somebody who needs help, they don't see if you're a woman or a man. They see, can you help my child? Can you help my husband? Do you have the qualifications? Do you have the merit? And it was that sense of equality that I saw in the hospital that I wished was more universal. So in 2011, the Libyan revolution broke out. And for the first time, that feeling of equality within the walls of the hospital was translatable. On the streets, women, alongside men, were active participants in the revolution. And not only were they participating, they were the very foundation of it. They provided information, they provided resources, they provided weaponry. And the most interesting part to me was that society as a whole embraced this, something that would have been unheard of a year or two ago. Now women were being taught to drive by their brothers and husbands so that they could better transport things. Now women were being asked to be participants in policy and in security. And knowing my history, I've always been a huge fan of history, I knew that that was something that happened in all conflicts. Go as far as time, and we find that in conflict, women are called upon. They are not treated by their gender. Instead, they are looked at as active participants. But immediately once that conflict ends, or once the political situation becomes even a bit more stabilized, we find women are pushed to the back again. And so in an effort to combat this, and to ensure that the old status quo would not take hold once the political climate stabilized, I founded an organization called the Voice of Libyan Women, which was dedicated to securing and advancing women's role in peace and security specifically, but ensuring also social and cultural change which would enable other young women and girls to take active public roles. So as early as our very first campaign, the Libyan Women's Charter, in 2011, only 2 weeks after liberation, we spoke with thousands of women. Now, the rest of the world was still extremely euphoric. Libya was considered the success story of the Arab Spring. I don't know how many of you remember, but in 2011, everyone had very high hopes. And it was women. While everybody else was vying for power and property and land and money, it was women who were sitting at tables saying, we will go down a very dangerous path. We need to do something. This is going to be, if we don't focus on transitional justice, if we don't focus on reconciliation, if we don't get more young men and young women at the table, we're going to be in a very big problem. People are beginning to feel like they're being ignored. People from the old regime are beginning to feel like they're being persecuted. So women from the very beginning were very clearly and very intelligently stating what needed to be done in Libya, as early as 2011. And of course, unfortunately, as history has shown, they were ignored. It was only a few months later that they were the first people to notice the rising signs of extremism. I myself remember as early as January of 2012 feeling less safe driving in the evening. Within months, other women were reflecting that. Schools, there was calls on schools to become segregated. There was calls on girls not to be allowed to study university. And it was women who were saying this. While everyone else was excited about the prospect of a free Libya, women were the ones who were collectively working to ensure that it could happen for everyone. So almost overnight, the dreams and aspirations I had for my own medical career had been put on indefinite hold. I traded in my prescriptions and diagnostics for international campaigns to address domestic violence, specifically, and transitional justice, security. And instead of consulting with my medical colleagues about treatment plans, I was now approaching leading religious scholars in Libya to authorize the use of religious sayings, or hadiths, for our groundbreaking Noor campaign. Little did I know that the very grueling world of medicine was exceptionally similar to the world of women's rights. My inner scientist took joy in researching all the attempts and all the ideas and all the efforts that came before my own. And of them, Resolution 1325 struck me the most. It became our greatest weapon as we fought for women's inclusion in Libya. Over the course of the next 3 years, we addressed kind of the intricacies of our highly valued social norms and how they impacted women's security. Now, Libya is not unique. In conflict and post-conflict countries around the world, women are seen as less threatening politically and economically, and they garner more societal trust than their male counterparts. In times of conflict, when communities tend to be very cautious of men who seem that like they want power and they want money, it's women who can come into the community and bridge the gaps. It's women who are more likely to compromise. Historically speaking, it's been women who have led to greater peace deals. Now, the importance of including women seems to be a glaringly obvious strategy to the rest of the world. As recent events have made clear, violent extremist organizations not only recognize women's strategy and agency, but they're more effective at speaking to them and with them. They leverage the women's strengths in their communities to strengthen their own power and influence. And for this reason, women are heavily recruited into these extremist organizations, employed as essential tools in their grand schemes of radical social change, to the detriment of global security. Rather than ensuring the active participation of women at peace tables, talks are conducted with those who are most harmful to communities. From my own experience in Libya, I know the only requirement for admission to the peace table is a gun, something I unfortunately have never owned. The message that this sends, that only men, and particularly armed men, should take part in peace processes, defies both logic and evidence. A study by the Graduate Institute of Geneva of 40 peace processes between 1990 and 2013 found that, far from weakening or complicating efforts, female involvement made it much likelier that a peace agreement benefiting both men and women would actually be reached. And statistically speaking, the inclusion of women meant that peace processes were over 35% more likely to last more than 5 years. Yet resistance persists. From 1992 to 2011, less than 4% of participants in peace agreements and 10% of negotiators at tables were women. Now, I'm sure we've all seen the picture of the Syrian peace talks. The internet has called it a manel, which is a panel of only men. Yeah, so the irony of this in a month where the same countries were collected in New York less than 2 weeks ago to talk about how important women's participation is really struck me when I saw that picture, and it reminded me why this conversation exists in the first place. Now, that's not to say that the past 15 years have not been without progress. The United Nations peacekeeping missions and mediation teams now include more female staff and gender experts. More than 50 countries now have formal national action plans to implement women, peace, and security agendas. From Rwanda to Afghanistan, women have entered parliaments in record numbers, and some progressive donors even earmark some of their resources to specifically address women, peace, and security. But at the same time, my experience in Libya rings globally true. The actual impact on the lives of women and girls on the ground is extremely minimal. And regardless of how many resolutions we put out, how much paperwork we put out, we do not have the structural capacity to be translating this into action on the ground. And we are not supporting the organizations which can. And that's a huge problem in the chain of events when we talk about what is the gap between implementation and theory. Our huge missing piece is that rather than focus on the people on the ground who have credibility, who have agency, the organizations which work in extremely dangerous situations, put their lives at risk every day, we instead try to do parachute efforts from the top up. We instead try to bring international organizations to come and cover ground that they simply can't. My experience in Libya was within a month we had numerous international organizations all come in at once, very disorganized, very uncoordinated, and all ask us to do projects they felt were important. We need 2,000 women trained to do this, and we need 400 women trained to do, and no, our donors want. And women on the ground would say, that is not what we need. So when we talk about the huge gap in implementation, why we are not getting the record numbers that we need to be getting, why we're not getting any numbers that we need to be getting on women's inclusion, it's because we are not working with the people who know the context the best and who can address it the best, and we're definitely not resourcing them. There are millions of dollars this year alone being put into things like countering violent extremism or women, peace, and security. And how much of that will trickle down? A pathetically small amount. How much of the money to counter violent extremism will actually go to women? 90% of women in Libya are teachers. That is where money needs to go. into schools, into areas where communities are already organized and where there's already credible trust, to build campaigns and projects where we can actually address people in places that they feel comfortable. And yet, unfortunately, the vast majority of that women will go to be training a few participants, a few military, rather than addressing the very, as he said, radical root problems that we have in peace and security. So, collectively, the international aid still falls short of what is needed, and the majority of national action plans have no budget or effective means to track progress. I actually joke sometimes that a lot of countries can get away with saying that they're progressive on women, peace, and security because they say, we're drafting a national action plan. What are you going to do with it? We're drafting it. And 10 years later, we're looking for the resources. So they're always working on women, peace, and security. You just never see it. Female participation in the prevention or resolution of conflicts is still seen largely as either a complication or a luxury. And while the women, peace, and security agenda has gained real global recognition politically over the past 15 years, our action on the ground does not reflect our commitments on paper. We simply pay lip service to the importance of women's participation without creating the actual necessary capacity. What this means is we need a radical shift in mindset and policy. It means the promotion of conflict prevention, rather than the adoption of overly militarized Band-Aid responses, which simply do not work. As a doctor, I can tell you, if you do not fix what's under the Band-Aid, it simply festers, and pretty soon, instead of having a little scar, you'll have to cut off your whole arm, and that's not what anybody wants. We must focus resources, expertise, and influence on the prevention and mitigation of conflict through a range of tools that can increase our chances of success. Prioritizing justice, global disarmament, which whenever I say that in the UN, they always say, don't say that word. But global disarmament, effective economic policy, representative political structures, accountable media, and social reform. The participation of women is critical in the prevention of conflict. Women have been engaging in unofficial prevention practices in their communities for centuries. So it's time that we recognize and incorporate that into official early warning systems and programs. We must institutionalize the involvement of women. It has to become a non-negotiable factor in peace and security. By partnering with women locally in the planning and implementation, we create responsive and effective service delivery models which are socially and culturally embraced. Before this conference this morning, we had actually been talking about the excuse of culture. All the time I hear, well, we can't include women. It's not culturally or traditionally acceptable here. And it struck me as interesting because following the revolution in Libya, and even now in the midst of conflict, we'll have organizations which come in for business deals usually, and they'll sit on the floor. They'll have meetings at 2 a.m. if they have to. They'll wake up early, they'll drive 200 kilometers to meet an elder in a small village if it means signing a multi-million-dollar deal. They will break every cultural barrier to get it done. But then we say, well, we need women at the table. Oh, no, that's not culturally acceptable. So suddenly, that's the limiting factor. What this means is that we need to create mechanisms which address urgent crises as well. Now, I know that you have all felt the effects of the crises in this region, at least, as have we in Libya. And so we recognize that emergencies are not gender neutral. Crises disproportionately affect women and girls and expose them to unique vulnerabilities, and most importantly, change the gender dynamics between men and women in their own communities, right? Women in crises are assaulted, they're exploited and abused for personal and economic gain, they're forced to flee their homes, marry young, and even to convert religiously. Women's rights activists in particular are hunted and threatened simply for voicing their opinions and demanding change in many of the communities we work in. So while we can continue to pay lip service to women's rights, we must recognize that the only way anything will get done on the ground is if we support those who every day leave their homes and actively try to change the status quo. We need to live in a world where those who demand justice are protected, where processes that exclude women are not supported or even tolerated in any form, where resources are allocated to women's inclusion and turned into plans and strategies for tangible support for women on the ground in places like Libya or Syria or Uganda. And I was once asked, how does the international community ensure that women are at the table? It came back to that cultural difficulty question. And I said, well, if there are talks happening, if you are going to be speaking with somebody and you make it a specific point to go and seek out the women in local communities, the men will come. The men will show up. Because if there are talks happening, they're going to want to be a part of it. So if you make it non-negotiable that women be at the table, the men will come. If the international community makes a show of going into local small municipalities and saying, where are the women? The men will bring their own. And if the international community brings women themselves, you cannot have a room full of suits asking local counterparts, where are your women? In Libya it happened, and the Libyan colleague said, well, where are yours? There is no doubt that Resolution 1325 was a tipping point for the global community and the women, peace, and security agenda. It opened doors and it shifted the political discourse. I was only 10 years old when it was adopted. I did not recognize its groundbreaking nature. I had no idea what the numbers meant, and yet it has proven extremely relevant to me 15 years later. It has shaped the way I work daily. It has allowed for me to enter rooms which I could not have been allowed to enter before. So I recognize the importance of having an internationally recognized document. But it's just not enough anymore. It is not enough. In order for us to realize the full potential of 1325, we have to partner with women and civil society organizations on the very front lines to counter the rising threats of insecurity, be it extremism, resource exploitation, mass migration, global warming, and any of the myriad causes of conflict. It is time we shift our support back to where it matters most, women. Anything less is not only at the cost of equality, it comes at the cost of international peace as well. Thank you.
Bé, doncs obrim el debat i si tenen alguna pregunta.
One quick disclaimer, only easy questions. Huh?
Only easy questions. Okay.
It's still early in the morning, we all just had our coffee.
Quería preguntar sobre la cuestión del extremismo violento. Me interesa especialmente su opinión, puesto que el país en el que vive y la región están muy afectadas por esta cuestión. Durante todo el debate a lo largo de la celebración de todos los acontecimientos del 15 aniversario de la resolución 1325, la revisión de alto nivel, la presentación del informe de Radhika Kumaraswamy, ha habido una tensión entre la opinión y la posición de la sociedad civil, preocupada por la utilización que puede hacerse internacionalmente del discurso sobre la violencia extremista y la lucha contra el terrorismo para fortalecer políticas militaristas que nada tienen que ver con la seguridad de las mujeres, y por otro lado los gobiernos defendiendo que en esta política contra el extremismo violento hay que integrar la perspectiva de género y hay que integrar a las mujeres. Y me gustaría saber cómo se vive ese debate, esa tensión entre estas dos posturas en una zona en la que las mujeres diariamente viven las consecuencias del extremismo violento, pero también las consecuencias de las políticas globales antiterroristas. Y igual no es una pregunta fácil y no tiene una respuesta, simplemente una reflexión sobre cuál es su posición al respecto. Gracias.
What's your name?
María Villellas.
So when I said easy questions, I think you misunderstood me.
I'm sorry.
It's fine, it's fine. I'll let this one slip. So it's interesting. My organization actually works very heavily on countering, which I like to call preventing violent extremism, because I think countering in and of itself is a very militarized term. The only way to counter something violent is with violence, unfortunately. So I think that's significant of who was at the table when that term was coined. And we've been working on it actually for the past 5 years. And our project has now been replicated in 24 countries, which is called the Noor campaign. And the Noor campaign takes religious sayings, disseminates them, and creates educational information about them. So, for example, the hadiths, which are the sayings of the Prophet, or verses from the Holy Book, the Quran, which are utilized by extremist organizations to entice people into extremism, we then use and we show the true meaning, or alternative meanings, if you would like, to communities. Now, and we do this through a myriad of mediums. So first, we start with media, through commercials and radio, particularly because of its influence in the region, billboards, and then we actually go into schools because we recognize that that is a collection where people are. It's easier to go to a school and get access to 2,000 young men than to try to go and find each of them in their homes. It's a place where you can have different conversations without feeling the threat of environmental factors or their local family or anything like that. So it opens up the conversation a lot. And that has been replicated. Now, with this new resolution, there is an overly militarized tone to women's participation in countering violent extremism. And it was something that Ruth and a fellow member of the advisory board and I had been talking about earlier today, which does worry me personally. Because it tends to afford itself more to the use of women as weapons of war rather than the protection and participation of women to ensure peace. And I do think because of the amount of money and interest in countering violent extremism, that was why it was drawn on. And I recognize that a lot of women's rights organizations are not necessarily happy, but are okay with this because they feel as though it brings more attention and more kind of recognition of women's roles. But it does worry me where the global agenda will take it, without a doubt. That being said, I also believe that it would be impossible to truly address violent extremism without the participation of women. And I believe now that we have been given this unfortunately very stringent view of women's participation in violent extremism, it's up to women's rights organizations, particularly those in the region, and that includes Spain because of how heavily affected it is by this, but women's rights organizations and peace think tanks to really take the view, the definition they've been given and say, no, this is the way women will participate. This is what we're going to do. Because there is a lot of, the space has been opened for women's voices in countering violent extremism, and there have been resources put into it. And it's up to us to say, we do not want to talk about simply training military. We also want to talk about how we're going to address the root causes. If you're going to ask to put 15% to training military, then give us 40%. To addressing the educational barriers, to addressing the societal structures. And I think that that's extremely important. But I'm very much on the middle of it because I do think it's wonderful to have international recognition of women's voices and roles. I think it's very, very dangerous for us to limit them simply as military machines. But 15 years ago, they were seen only as victims. So, I mean, hopefully, we're slowly moving up. I really don't know. But that was a wonderfully difficult question. Thank you for that.
Bueno, hola, buenos días y muchas gracias también por la ponencia que ha sido muy, muy interesante. Yo quería aprovechar la oportunidad de tu conocimiento de la experiencia del caso de Libia para saber cuál es tu valoración de cómo ha sido la implicación de las mujeres en el proceso más actual de búsqueda de una solución política con intervención de Naciones Unidas y hasta qué punto este proceso también refleja las paradojas de lo que supone la garantía, o se suponen las ciertas garantías, bien digo, del marco internacional versus los gaps que encontramos en la práctica en términos de una participación real y efectiva de las mujeres en este proceso. Muchas gracias. Mi nombre es Pamela.
I feel like we're going to have to redefine easy for the audience. We're going to go back. That's a wonderful question. Thank you so much, Pamela. I personally have a very... The UN says I'm very blunt in my opinions. And this is one in which I have been very vocal. The current situation in Libya, particularly the attempt at finding a political solution, has been, in my opinion, very pathetic. There has been no interest in ensuring the active participation of women. The exact opposite. Local counterparts have said we would prefer women aren't there, and the UN has said, okay. then women won't be there. And to me, it's so interesting because the UN has the ability to leverage over 200 countries. It has the ability to leverage influence and policy. It has the ability to leverage economic sanctions. It has the ability to leverage quite a few things. And yet, when local militias say, we don't want women there, we don't want people from this city there, we don't want minorities there, the UN, in all its recognized and institutionalized power, says, okay, well, as long as you're at the table. And that's not how we should be doing it. We should not be catering to a bunch of men with guns. I'm sorry, but it's the idea that that is what we're doing to get them at the table. Yes, they need to be at the table. They have the guns, but so does everybody else. Because the problem is that a lot of these militias are not in their local communities. They're based on military camps 20 to 30 kilometers away. And they sign a peace agreement that the local community first doesn't know about, but second doesn't recognize, because the local community has its own animosities. And so once this is signed and money is given, because that's what a peace talk is, right? It's a bunch of bad guys with guns who have killed other people forgiving other bad guys. Like, oh, okay, and and agreeing to get a certain sum of money or certain positive outcomes to put their guns down. But it doesn't recognize that while these bad guys were fighting, there was a lot of damage done to local communities, and they might not be ready to have a conversation about peace unless you want to have a conversation about transitional justice and reconciliation and what exactly is going to happen to perpetrators, and unless you have a system of law and order, right? And so that's been a huge gap in Libya. We've been having talks out of Libya with people who are not representative of the local communities, do not speak for the local communities, and are not trusted by the local communities. And that's where the involvement of women is so important, because while all the men are fighting, women are the ones who are making sure the lights stay on. They're the ones teaching the students. They're the ones that have this credibility in their local communities, that when they take to a peace table and they say, you know what, this is what my local community needs for it to be okay for us to put down our guns, they go back to the local community, and the local community looks at them with a sense of trust and respect, because this is a person who they do not see as having ulterior motives. This is a person who has not made any money off of the conflict. And so that's your major issue. The second thing with peace talks is usually, in my opinion, and particularly in Libya, everybody sitting around the table doesn't really want peace. If you're making $5 million a day because you have control of the major highway, why on earth would you sign a peace deal? It just doesn't make sense. If I was making $5 million a day off of war, I wouldn't want peace either. And what, go back to my small mom and pop shop where I make less than $1,000 a month? Why? Why? I have prestige, I have power, I have control. The only people that would want change are the ones who are most vulnerable, are the people who sit at home without electricity for 21 hours a day, are the people who worry if their kids will come home safe, are the people who have bombs and guns coming into their schools as they're teaching 5- and 6-year-old students. Those are the people who want peace. And when you can get them at the table, then you'll have a realistic conversation. But unfortunately, in Libya, the United Nations and Libyan counterparts, I give equal blame to both sides, to be honest, although a bit more to the UN, because they've been doing this for God knows how many years and still seem to be getting it wrong, but has been dismal on both sides. There's been no recognition of having the people who need to be at the table there, and peace talks continue to fail because people start missing the amount of money they were making, and the international community says, well, what went wrong? You didn't have women. You didn't have the people who want peace the most, who have the least to gain from war. And until you get those people at the table, you will continue to have conflict. You will continue to have people who manipulate media. You will continue to have people who manipulate local communities. You will continue to have people who prey on the most basic fears of their local communities because it makes them money and it makes them powerful. And unfortunately, I personally don't see the current solution happening with the UN in Libya. I just don't. Not unless it changes. I hope nobody from the UN in Libya is here. If so, we can talk later.
Buenos días, yo soy Virginia. Muchas gracias por venir hoy aquí. Me ha encantado su intervención. Mi pregunta era en relación a Naciones Unidas. Tiene muchos defectos, es un dinosaurio, pero la necesitamos. Entonces, mi pregunta es un poco personal, era ¿cómo se siente usted siendo tan joven, siendo mujer, con tanta energía, siendo tan directa y tan clara,
frente a un dinosaurio tan grande. Hay posibilidades también de cambiar este dinosaurio y hacerlo útil. Gracias.
Okay, so easy means. Oh, wow. Can we change the dinosaur? So first, thank you very much, Virginia. Wow. The UN and I have had a very interesting relationship. When I first started my organization, I actually had a lot of personal animosity towards the UN. When they came into Libya in 2011, it was exceptionally disorganized. I cannot tell you. You had the United Nations, so you had UNDP, this UN family, UNDP, UNFPA, UN, everyone doing something different, no one knowing what the other one was doing, and they would tell us to be coordinated. Like, you Libyan women need to work together. I'm like, you guys don't even know what's going on among your own So it was a mess, and all spending enormous amounts of money. I think it was 20,000 a day for their protection, except then they would tell local women's organizations, well, you should go into the communities. And I'd say, well, where's their protection? It is more likely that a local activist will get killed than somebody from the UN. What support can you offer that person? When you're having a peace talk, for example, you don't invite them. But when you need them to go and sell your idea, you call them up. And you say, listen, we need you to make this happen on the ground. So it was I felt that it was a very manipulative relationship where the United Nations has specific things it wants to gain, and it tries to work with whoever is easiest to get it done on the ground without actually giving them any, institutional support. So in 2014, I was asked to be on the advisory board for this 1325 global study. And I went to my dad and I said, I don't really think the United Nations does anything, so I don't want to do this. And my dad says to me, well, the only way you're going to change anything is if you're there. You can't complain about something. It's like an election. If you don't vote, you can't complain. So you can't complain if you're not there to give your voice. So I went, and as Ruth can tell you, got a very quick reputation for being overly opinionated, which I think is good in the UN. And it gave me a different perspective on the United Nations. It is the most bureaucratic nightmare, and I say this in Spain, knowing the EU. So I mean, the UN is a whole nother level of bureaucracy. And yet, there are, I think, people who are exceptionally dedicated to global peace and security. I think there are tools that if we were able to leverage them properly within the United Nations, we could completely change the global landscape. The UN has a political and economic and institutional power that is unmatched. There is no doubt about it. My problem is with the execution. So the structure exists and structurally needs to change because it hasn't. I mean, the UN has not changed in decades. And in a very quickly changing world, that's one of the reasons it's so far behind. It cannot address today's conflicts because it was not built for them. It wasn't built for them. And the nature of war and peace has changed so much since the 1940s, since the 1960s, since the 1980s. It has. Our global dynamics, it's all completely different. And we need to recognize that in order to address today's challenges, we need to reshape a UN for today. But I do think it has unmatched potential. I do. That might be because I am young and naive. I've met a lot of people who are older than me who say it'll never change, it's not possible, I don't know. But I do think that if we were to be able to have the influence of younger voices in particular, because I do think that they bring different perspectives, I think that they look at peace and security very differently than the people who have been occupying the space in the UN for the past 20, 30, 40, 50 years. But I do think new perspectives, and I think more international perspectives. The United Nations is dominated by people of a particular political and economic mindset. And I think that once you get people from the developing world, more people involved, and people from communities where they have not had the benefits that your current leaders within the UN have had, you're going to get voices that talk more about the very fundamentals of human security, of about what's extremely important, of about stability and less about the economic output for particular countries. So I think that if we were to depoliticize a lot of the humanitarianism and a lot of the peace efforts in the UN, if we were to get new voices, particularly young women, but also young men, and if we were to take an honest look at who is represented within the UN, then we can start creating a system which is more globally representative. But I do think there's potential, no doubt. I come very hard on them, but I do think there's potential.
Muchísimas gracias por esta oportunidad de escucharla. Hay una cosa que hoy lamento terriblemente y es no hablar inglés. Porque me encantaría sentarme horas y horas y horas con usted y podérmela llevar a mi casa y bueno, no sé. Me he transportado yo ahora tengo 52 años y me he transportado a cuando tenía 25 en Colombia. Yo trabajaba con las comunidades, con comunidades de mujeres, con comunidades campesinas, con comunidades indígenas. Y estoy totalmente de acuerdo con la gran mayoría de las cosas que ha expresado, pero sí que estoy absolutamente convencida, y me ha convencido mi vida y mi historia, de que gran parte de la responsabilidad, o sea, ir a la raíz de todo el problema de las mujeres, escuchar la experiencia de Libia es estar escuchando la experiencia de Colombia. No hay muchas diferencias. ¿Por qué? Porque la raíz del problema es un modelo social, es un modelo global, es el modelo económico, es el modelo patriarcal. Si queremos ir a la raíz, hay que cambiar eso. Pero cuando yo trabajaba con las comunidades, uno de los grandes retos que tuvimos que plantearnos era poder cambiar la mentalidad de las mujeres en las comunidades. ¿Por qué? Porque la mentalidad tan arraigada de que el papel de la mujer era estar al lado del hombre o estar en el hogar, pero que su responsabilidad o su participación no iba más allá, afortunadamente ha cambiado un poco, desafortunadamente no mucho. Y esto lo tengo que decir por la militancia que llevo estos últimos años aquí, por el tema de los diálogos y conversaciones, por el proceso de paz y la falta de participación, no solo de las mujeres, de todos los movimientos sociales, de todas las comunidades, de la sociedad civil en general. Estoy de acuerdo que los diálogos entre los malos, los armados y los estamentos gubernamentales no es la paz. Eso lo tengo clarísimo, pero es necesario. Es un paso necesario. Y yo soy una de las personas que planteo que no me gustaría, por ejemplo, que en los diálogos de La Habana se estuviera negociando el modelo, porque el modelo se tiene que negociar con la sociedad, no entre esos dos actores. Yo lo que quiero es que ellos se pongan de acuerdo para dejar las armas. Ese es el único papel. O sea, yo no quiero que ellos discutan allá cuál va a ser el papel de la sociedad civil, o cuál va a ser el papel de las mujeres, o cuál va a ser el papel de los indígenas, o cuál va a ser el papel de los campesinos. A mí no me interesa eso. Yo lo único que quiero es que ellos dejen las armas. Los dos grupos terroristas, terrorismo de Estado y el terrorismo de las armas, de la insurgencia. Por eso, a mí la verdad es que la lucha porque participen en una mesa de negociaciones las mujeres o las víctimas, sí, es importante, es un paso, es una visibilización, pero la importancia real es el papel que se les ha de dar en las comunidades y en la sociedad, y la participación para el cambio de mentalidad, de cultura y de modelo de economía. Creo que eso es lo que… Ya está, gracias.
What's your name?
Mi nombre es Nelly. Nelly.
So first, I would love to be kidnapped by you. I'm completely okay with this. I will learn Spanish, and next time I come to Barcelona, this will be, we're done, it's happening, we have a date. So first, you said a word which, when I say it, people always, or you gave an idea of global disarmament, which is the idea of putting the weapons away. And I think I completely agree with you that we have a broken model There's no doubt about that. Globally, we have a broken model. It very heavily caters men, but also the economic importance of peace and security, right? So we find that war tends to make everybody a lot of money, even the countries which get involved in kind of diffusing conflict. But here's the problem. The reason I think that it is so important to have women physically at the table is because nobody is going to hear your opinion, Nellie, if you're not there to say it. So if women are not at the table, the only thing that they hear at the table is the current model. It becomes replicated. Everybody agrees because everybody benefits. And it's only once women are at the table that you can talk about those root problems. It is only once women are at the table in Libya that you can talk about the problems in the community. Because if they're not there, they continue to work on the model. And that's why it's lasted so long. The reason that this global model has lasted centuries is because men have been at the table. So I disagree. I don't think it's just about visibility. I think it's about voice. I think it's about agency. I think it's about changing the status quo. And in my family, we have 5 boys and 6 girls. And my brothers always joke with me. They say, you know what, how about if it had been 6 boys and 5 girls? What do you think would have happened then? And I personally think the girls still would have won out because we're geniuses. But my brothers disagree. Even they in there recognize that within a small family unit, there is a significant importance to how many people you have at a table. Because it changes it. When you have 30% of women in parliament, it drastically reduces corruption. Numbers are important. And the scientist in me appreciates it so much. I like research. I like the statistics. I can hear a lot of sad stories about women in any country. And yes, it makes me feel, bad for the local community. But when people bring me numbers, it makes, for example, if from a medical standpoint, it makes no sense to, let me give an example. To combat cancer without chemotherapy. It makes no sense in a lot of cases, right? If you can, you do. Because you have that option. It's more cost-effective, it's smarter, you'll actually survive, right? But for some reason, when it comes only to peace and security, we don't use the most practical, common-sense solution of including women, and we continue to work on this old model. Now, when it comes to changing the mentality, I've heard so many times, even in the most developed countries, from the most educated people, women and men, they're equal but different. We're looking for gender justice, not gender equality. All these little, and I think it's so funny because it says so much about our mentality. And the mentality is going to be so difficult to change, and I agree with you, and it's going to take generations. But I do think the very, very fundamental, the number one step to changing the mentality, even of other women. And in Libya, that was initially, that was the most difficult thing for me, was women who told me, this is not the way we do things. You need to stop giving your opinion. And it was only until men stood up and said, give your opinion, were the women more on board. That was how impacting that mentality is. That's how important having those allies is. But it's until we change that mentality that we can have realistic conversations about global disarmament. It's not until we change that conversation that we can have honest conversations about peace and security. And I think in order to have those conversations, we need to be there. So I do think women at the table, I think the representation of women who recognize women's agency, and that's very important. And even of men who recognize women's agency. I wouldn't mind having Raphael at a peace talk. If he's going to sit there and say women are more important than men, I'm going to be like, yes, right? And that's what we need. We need to have those voices at the table. Sorry? Oh, I thought you were saying. You're agreeing with me, I know.
Bé, muchas gracias a todos. Esta ha sido la última pregunta. Le doy de nuevo las gracias a la señora Mourabit, no solo por la conferencia, sino por todas las respuestas que ha dado, que han sido extraordinariamente inteligentes, y me he quedado con varias frases que a mí me han impactado mucho, como en ciertos lugares uno de los diálogos es poner el arma sobre la mesa, y también ha sido muy iluminador todo lo que ha dicho sobre Naciones Unidas y la fe que ha demostrado en esta organización tan criticada.